The United States is in the middle of deploying a missile defense system to South Korea called THAAD. The Department of Defense states that the objective of deploying THAAD to South Korea is to protect US and South Korea from incoming missile attacks from North Korea. But if we examine the situation a little closer, things become very suspicious. First, what is missile defense? Missile defense is defined as a system, weapon, or technology involved in the detection, tracking, interception, and destruction of attacking missiles. As you can see, when an attacking missile is in flight, missile defense systems, which are made up of several components from radars, satellites, and interceptor missiles, all work together to target the incoming missile and to shoot it down with a hit-to-kill missile. Sounds like a great idea, right? Well, that's only if things go as planned. And in war, things never go as planned. In actuality, missile defense systems create what's called a first strike capability. During the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, both countries had MAD, mutually assured destruction, meaning if one country shot a nuclear warhead, the other would retaliate, resulting in both countries mutually destroying each other. But a missile defense system gets rid of mutually assured destruction, giving one side an advantage. And during the Cold War, both the US and the Soviet Union realized this and signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 1972. But unfortunately, President George W. Bush withdrew the US from the treaty in 2002.
Today, I have given formal notice to Russia, in accordance with the treaty, that the United States of America is withdrawing from this almost 30-year-old treaty.
The history between North Korea and the United States has been a history of threats and destruction. Many people do not realize that the US completely destroyed North Korea in the Korean War, and since has threatened North Korea with nuclear strike for decades.
You know, many people don't realize that the United States has maintained a nuclear first strike threat against North Korea going back all the way to the Korean War. From 1958 to 1989, the U.S. had hundreds of nuclear weapons in South Korea. And then in the early 90s, when the Soviet Union collapsed and North Korea faced an existential crisis, it turned to developing nuclear weapons to create a deterrence.
You see, the only country in the world that's developing missile defense systems at the rate that the US is developing is, well, the US. Other countries have realized the faults in missile defense systems. These systems cost billions of dollars, and they haven't even been proven to work. Well, you may ask, why is the US spending billions of tax dollars on a system that doesn't work? According to Jack Matlock, who was the last US ambassador to the Soviet Union, recently told President Putin that missile defense is not to threaten Russia or any other country, but for a jobs creation program.
Не поддерживаю системы ПРО. И основной источник этого – это не угрожать России, это чтобы были рабочие места в США, ведь это военно-промышленный комплекс, и сколько людей там работает.
For a decade now, the Pentagon has been deploying missile defense systems all over the world with particular focus on Eastern Europe, which encircles Russia, as well as encircling China and North Korea in East Asia. The most recent and controversial of these systems is THAAD.
The system in question is called THAAD.
THAAD missile defense system.
Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System in South Korea.
The U.S. is racing to deploy THAAD, a missile defense system on South Korean soil, insisting it's purely about protection from North Korea.
In July 2016, the US and South Korean governments announced a joint decision to deploy THAAD. Since that time, several countries have expressed their concern for their own national security, including North Korea, China, Russia, and even the citizens of South Korea. The decision was made solely by the governments, not the people of the United States or South Korea. And since that time, China has been putting pressure on South Korea to reverse this decision, ranging from boycotting Lotte products to limiting Chinese tourism in South Korea. THAAD stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. The original deployment site of THAAD was at the anti-aircraft missile base in the middle of Songju County. Then, after outrage and protest, the site was moved to the Lotte Golf Course, which is closer to Gimcheon, creating even more outrage and protests. Both governments just recently completed a land transfer of a golf course owned by the Lotte Corporation, giving the golf course to the U.S. military, where the South Korean government will pay maintenance expenses such as electricity and water fees. Now, THAAD is made up of several components, but only two of them are controversial: the radar and the interceptor. The radar poses a threat to nearby countries, especially China, because it breaches their territory as well as undermines their deterrence capability. With all this being said, THAAD has been proven ineffective. Missile defense expert Ted Postol, a professor from MIT, suggests a few arguments against THAAD. 1. THAAD is extremely easy to defeat.
The important thing about the interceptors for the audience to be aware of is that they basically must hit their targets while the targets are basically in the near vacuum of space. And this results in an extremely high level of vulnerability to countermeasures. The interceptor basically looks ahead to find the target it's going to hit. And the target appears like a point of light. It's an infrared homing sensor. So you can think of the target as just looking like just a point of light. The interceptor cannot see any details of shape. And all an adversary needs to do is to intentionally break up the missile that launched the warhead, and the interceptor would see many points of light, and it would have no way of determining which point of light is the warhead. So it is extremely easy to defeat.
2. The U.S. military has a history of exaggerating test results, many times downright lying.
Now, we know from past claims about successful testing that they have been false. For example, prior to the Gulf War of 1991, the same company, Raytheon, that builds the THAAD, claimed that there were 17 tests against ballistic missiles against Patriot interceptors, and they were successful 17 out of 17 times. In the Gulf War of 1991, following these tests, the Patriots were successful 0 out of 44 times. So the tests, when they have been done, do not appear to be close to realistic. And of course, there's no information on the character of the tests except the claim, which is very likely to be false, that the tests were successful.
3. The deployment of THAAD will only increase tensions between countries in the region.
It will not materially provide any defensive capability to South Korea. That's a technical statement. I'm just saying this as a technical expert. And politically, this is more of a statement now as an American ally of South Korea, who's concerned about what I as an American believe is a bad American policy. It will certainly increase tensions between the United States and China. It has already, and as expected by me at least, has greatly increased tensions between South Korea and China. And I believe, I'm not an expert in South Korea, I want to be clear about that, but from what I have seen in South Korea, it, in my view, is understandably creating tensions between South Korea and the United States.
A professor of politics and international studies, Jae Jung Seo, has expressed several arguments against THAAD as well.
THAAD actually would not work to defend South Korea, because this system is designed to work at higher altitude, higher than 45 kilometers. But most of North Korean missiles are short-range missiles that would fly below 45 kilometers. And so that will be ineffective against most of North Korean short-range missiles. Furthermore, THAAD will be deployed if the plan proceeds in Seongju, which is south of Seoul. And since Seongju is far from Seoul, it would not be able to protect Seoul, the capital city, the most popular city. And so, even if that works, it would not. It would leave out those most populous and the most important politically and military place in South Korea. So, from the South Koreans' perspective, that just doesn't make sense. And so both in Europe and Asia, the U.S. is deploying missile defense systems that would undermine Chinese deterrence capability and Russian deterrence capability. On top of the fact that missile defense will undermine North Korea's deterrence capability. So overall, the U.S. is deploying missile defense systems around the Korean Peninsula, around East Asia and Europe, in order to acquire a first strike capability against 1, North Korea, 2, China, 3, Russia.
THAAD is just one of many anti-missile systems of the United States. A recent report from the Missile Defense Agency in February 2017 has shown that of all the anti-missile tests, over 50% have failed. David Sanger from the New York Times reports, Mr. Obama concluded that the $300 billion spent since the Eisenhower era on traditional anti-missile systems, often compared to hitting a bullet with a bullet, failed the core purpose of protecting the continental United States. Flight tests and interceptors based in Alaska and California had an overall failure of 56%, under near-perfect conditions. One alternative to wasting money on anti-missile systems when dealing with North Korea is to engage with them through diplomacy. In fact, diplomacy has proven to work in the past. As this graph from Dr. Jae Jung-seo shows, engaging with North Korea through talks has been very consistent. I'll let Noam Chomsky explain.
Well, it's kind of interesting to look at the record. The claim is, well, we've tried everything, nothing works, therefore we have to use force. Is it true that nothing's worked? I mean, there is a record after all. And if you look at the record, it's interesting. 1994, Clinton established what was called the Framework Agreement with North Korea. And North Korea would terminate its efforts to develop nuclear weapons. The U.S. would reduce hostile acts. It more or less worked, and neither side lived up to it totally, but by 2000, North Korea had not proceeded with its nuclear weapons programs. George W. Bush came in and immediately launched an assault on North Korea, acts of evil, sanctions, and so on. North Korea turned to producing nuclear weapons. The opportunity to move towards a negotiated diplomatic settlement does not seem outlandish.
Donald Trump wants to share a hamburger with Kim Jong-un. That's a very good idea. But the idea of using force against North Korea when even their artillery, 10,000 guns north of Seoul, conventional artillery can take out a city that has a third of the South Korean population, you just really have no military option on the Korean Peninsula.
And I've been saying this for years. I think the only way out of this for the United States is to hold direct negotiations and talks with North Korea on stopping its nuclear program and stopping its missile program.
There is really only one way to achieve real peace in the Asia-Pacific when dealing with North Korea: just sitting down and talking. Using military force always ends in disaster on both sides. And as General Smedley Butler said, war is a racket. It always has been. A few profit and the many pay.